Good morning, everyone. We're so pleased you've joined us this morning, along with about 100 other participants who work with young children and their families in Minnesota in a wide variety of capacities. Today, among you are early childhood special education teachers and ECFE, family education teachers. We have county social workers and school nurses, Head Start staff and daycare providers. There are preschool teachers, paraprofessionals, program directors, there's special ed director, community ed director, school psychologist, child care resource and referral staff. We have speech language pathologists, OTs and PTs, early childhood screeners. There are a group of behavioral therapists and many more. So we welcome you all in cubicles and offices and groups and classrooms across the state. We have participants from Austin and Faribault, Wilmer, Warroad, Parkers Prairie, Detroit Lakes, Glencoe, Iota, and even a few who snuck over the North Dakota border. So we want to welcome you all. The webinar format that's making this possible today is pretty new to us, and it may be new to you as well. We really appreciate your patience and flexibility as we launch out into new territory. And first, we'd just like to cover a few housekeeping details. The slide on your screen is going to be the active presentation, and over on the right-hand side is the webinar toolbox. And just want you to know that once we get through some of the information where I explain that, you can use the triple arrows in the upper left-hand corner to minimize that during the presentation. But today's webinar is scheduled from 8:30 to 10:30. We are going to have an optional question and answer session for half an hour approximately after the webinar from 10:30 to 11. Your phone lines are muted, so you don't have to worry about making noise on your end. And the way that you can submit questions is by using the question and answer feature on that right-hand webinar toolbox section. You'll find the location there for you to click, and then you type in your question and we will get it via email, and we'll be answering those later on in the presentation. Those that we don't have time for today, we plan on posting post-production on our website. I also want to mention that although you received a link to our materials ahead of time, if you didn't have time to print those off after the webinar, you may go to our website and find a variety of additional resources for working with young children and their families from diverse cultures, and we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go along today. The evaluation surveys for this webinar are going to be web-based and will be emailed to you after the presentation today. And when we receive the completed evaluations, we will be sending you the certificates of completion that you can use for your CEUs and other professional organizations. So if you have any questions as we go along, you can also email those questions. We'll be receiving questions throughout the presentation, and then if you have questions after the webinar, I can be your contact. And my name is Barb Zimke. I'm a parent advocate and trainer here at PACER, and I also coordinate this parent outreach project. And so any kinds of technical questions around the follow-up to this webinar can be directed to me at bzimke@pacer.org. I also want to mention that today's webinar is being made possible with funds through a grant from the Minnesota Department of Education's Federal State Personnel Development Grant. And it's part of, as I said, a larger parent outreach project. And so today, many of you may not particularly be early childhood special educators, but all of the people who have signed up for the webinar do work with families of young children and work with diverse families. So we're really excited to get going on the presentation. We have a really full, fast-paced, exciting agenda, and I'm going to just briefly go over that with you before we get started. This is a three-part webinar, and we'll begin with part one in just a minute. Our keynote speaker will be presenting Serving Diverse Families, Strategies for Early Childhood Service Providers, and that will take approximately an hour. And then we'll be moving to part two, where our multicultural advocates are going to do a panel presentation where each one will present practical tips for professionals working with families for successful interaction. And that will be followed with hands-on exercise to help take the learning from philosophy to experience, and that will be with our early childhood coordinator at PACER, Judy Sweat, from Family Concerns to Family Directed Outcomes, a case study exercise. And then at the conclusion, we will have the optional question and answer period. So I think we're ready to begin, and I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Dixie Jordan is a nationally certified cultural competence trainer and a board member of the National Federation of Families. She has been at PACER Center for 23 years. She's also the lead writer of the curriculum that's going to be shared today. And she has conducted more than 600 trainings, presentations, and keynotes nationally. We're really fortunate to have Dixie presenting to us today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm anxious to get us started because we have a lot of information jam-packed in a fairly short timeline. Fortunately for all of us, though, we do have access to copies of this information. Also, it will be stored so that you can access it later. So without further ado, let's start moving. The idea of diversity is one that has been prevalent in Minnesota for quite some time. When I first moved here, we had 5% diversity throughout the state. Today, the picture of diversity is so substantially different that it's almost difficult to recognize the state. Between 2005 and 2015, in Minnesota, the non-white population is expected to grow by 35%, while the white population will grow in that same time period by only 7%. If you note that those of Hispanic origin are particularly expected to grow by 47%. So the face of Minnesota is changing dramatically. You've probably already noticed that it's changed. But a full 19% of children under the age of 15 will be non-white by 2015. So we really do need to pay attention to the ways in which we can begin to address the needs and ensure inclusion of diverse families within our structure, particularly for early childhood. So I'm going to spend a moment talking about culture because it is so much more than meets the eye. Typically, when you hear about culture, you talk about the food or the language or the music or the celebrations of diversity. And those are the things that we can see, those things that come to us through our senses. Visible culture are the celebrations and rituals and reconnections to community, the dress, the food, the clothing. In other words, they're the things that we see, and they tend to be the things we celebrate most often. There are, however, sets of understood rules which go much deeper, and those rules include such things as how we treat one another, how introductions are conducted, our concept and use of time, and our conduct across situations. Going even deeper into culture, there are sets that all of us have been exposed to of unconscious rules that govern how we communicate with one another, the kind of voice tone we use, our use of verbal versus nonverbal communication, eye contact, whether we like to or don't like to be touched. And all of these rules create some real problems if we cross those cultural boundaries without understanding them fully. So if you make a mistake in our visible culture, those mistakes tend to be overlooked. And such a mistake might be, and I made this mistake, so I can speak to it quite freely, might be calling a cultural garb a costume. And I actually did that on the Zuni Nation and was reprimanded quite severely by someone. The reason I was reprimanded is because we were friends. If we had not been friends, then that mistake might have been a more serious one. So typically, we overlook the mistake if you call the food by the wrong name or call dress a costume. We tend to forgive. However, there's a set of understood rules. What does on time mean for you? How do you greet another person? Do you shake hands or not shake hands? Which, if we violate those, and we tend to do so quite unconsciously, we run the risk of offending the person who is interacting with us, who has a different concept than we do. To compound it even further, there's a set of unconscious rules that can generate very strong and very negative responses. And sometimes you don't even know why a person is offended. You only know that you have managed to offend someone. This happens with all of us, and it happens all the time. It will continue to happen. Certainly people who participate in cultural training don't learn and cannot learn all the unconscious rules of a culture other than the one they've participated in. So it's really better, if you possibly can, to learn as much as you can, not about the persons you're working with, but about yourself. Why do you have a strong negative response when someone offends you? What is your sense of personal space? And when someone violates that, how do you feel? So culture is more about learning about oneself than it is about learning about the other. Having said that, there's a great deal we can learn that will help us not to make these mistakes over time. Cultural communication is probably the most important because it's something that you see on a daily basis. And communication is only a continuum of preferences for how we greet one another, how we get along with one another, whether we prefer a direct or indirect communication style. In America, in general, we tend to prefer direct communication, which is to say, you will come up to me, initiate a handshake, and say, "Hi, how are you? What do you do for a living?" And that's perfectly acceptable in a majority cultural setting. But it may not be acceptable at all in a culture or in a family that prefers a more indirect method of communication. How do you learn about these things? Well, first you listen. And you figure out how to adapt your inquiries to fit their preferences. For instance, what do you do for a living as a question might be really problematic for very traditional individuals within their culture, Hispanic culture in particular, Native American or Asian cultures. For these parents, asking a direct question can feel confrontational, even accusatory, even when that is clearly not your intent. A more indirect conversational style. Here's an example. "You take such good care of your family. You must have a good job. Can you tell me a little bit about it?" is much more acceptable to someone who comes from an indirect culture and is often much more successful, especially if you've told the families first something about yourself and about your preferences. The formal or informal communication preference relates to how we address one another. Many times, professionals will tend to call parents by their first name, or will call them mom or call them dad. And without gaining overt permission from a family, this may be extremely culturally inappropriate to do. So even though you may have an informal communication preference, that's not necessarily true of your family. Furthermore, some families want to have an informal communication style within their family, but they want their children and other members of the family to regard professionals in a formal way. So a tip here is to simply ask the family, "What should I call you? How should I address you?" You can call me Dan, or you can call me Dr. Smith. Give people permission to address you, and understand that no matter how much you give them permission to call you by your first name, some families will insist on formal communication with professionals. And the decision-making preferences for families relates to also an important communication variable, which is that typically in American culture, parents make decisions about their children. But frequently in cultures that are non-American in origin, people will defer to elders within their community. They will defer to spiritual experts. They will defer to grandparents. They will defer to non-relative caregivers. And so you need to ask who makes those educational decisions within a family and offer the opportunity for that person to be present at meetings. Physical proximity is one of those things that I would bet no one in the audience has measured. How far or how near can a person stand to you before you begin to feel uncomfortable? Everyone has a concept of it, and is uncomfortable when it's been violated. So look for those cues to help you understand if you're sitting or standing too close to a family. That's usually not measured in inches, but by golly, you know when it's been violated because someone is suddenly in your space and in your face, and it doesn't feel right. So if you find parents inching away from you when you're speaking, the likelihood is you're standing too close for their cultural preference and need to back up a little bit and give them some space. That also applies to putting your hands on a parent or on a child without reason. And when I say without reason, there are many reasons to touch a child, but those reasons have to be clearly explained to families that you're trying to do an exercise or conduct an evaluation. Touch is necessary. But it's also necessary to gain the overt permission of parents when you want to do something with their child. Even if you believe parents don't mind one way or the other, it's important to ask so that parents get to make these decisions about their own life and their child's well-being. Eye contact is one of those things that people talk about often. In America, as a culture, and in fact in Western cultures in general, we tend to be very direct, we tend to make strong eye contact with one another, and yet in other cultures that's not necessarily true. Some parents may not make eye contact in a way that's familiar to you. They may glance at you and look away. They may sit with their hands folded in their lap with their eyes downcast. And often we make assumptions about what this means. But are our assumptions the same as theirs? These are key questions to ask yourself. Sometimes simply showing respect means not looking directly at a person. So if the eye contact is different, do not make an assumption about what that means based on your own cultural experience. Don't interpret it to mean that people are disinterested or disrespectful, but simply expressing a cultural preference for how one communicates with another human being. And in fact, in some cultures, it's considered very disrespectful to make sustained eye contact. It's important to know this, so if you find parents looking away, they may be showing you an overt form of respect as it's practiced within their own culture. Deference or getting along is a very often misunderstood cultural preference in American society. In fact, we tend to think that we should be able to speak back and forth with one another, and if someone disagrees, they're going to jump up and say, I don't agree with you. But families from some cultures will display respect by agreeing with everything you say, because the relationship is much more important to them than finding agreement. Building the relationship with a professional is sometimes more important than creating services for a child. And if that happens, it's really important to remind parents over and over again, if necessary, that they are the experts in the needs of their children, and that their contribution is absolutely invaluable. This may take you a long time. My suggestion is please don't give up, because it takes a very long time sometimes to build relationships when there are such vast differences in our practices. Some families will just simply sit and nod when you're speaking to them, and that means to them that they're listening, not necessarily that they agree or understand what you're saying. So a key question for you is, how will you know if parents understand what's being communicated? What strategies are you going to use as a professional to make sure that when you leave the room, the parents have understood clearly what it is you've had to say? I'm not giving you an answer. I'm just giving you a thought so that you, when you meet with these families, are careful to make sure that when they leave, the power and the understanding is in their hands. Perception is the meaning that we place on what we see, such as the behaviors of others. So what we see isn't what we look at, but how we interpret what we see. A really good example of this is the common handshake. If you're going to shake hands with a person, and that person comes to you and doesn't want to shake your hand, it's very easy to believe that that person doesn't respect us, is afraid of us, and they may be expressing a cultural preference that's simply different than the one you're expressing. So each of us come to a place where we will look at the behaviors of other people, whether those are behaviors that are highly observable or whether those are ways of showing deference. And when we look at those behaviors, it's important not to attribute a meaning to them unless the meaning is clearly understood, because everyone sees life differently. In this picture, the two twins are very much alike, and yet each of them will have a very different perspective on what it is he or she is looking at. Others may not place the same meaning with what they see, and checking perceptions builds the partnership. Finding a common ground, asking the questions about how do you look at this, what would you like to see happen, helps us understand the various perspectives that we bring to this. This is really a product of cultural training. We look at the world through our own cultural filters. That's not bad, that's not wrong. But everyone else will look at the world through their cultural filters as well, and that simply may not be the same. Well, we're going to talk for a moment about focusing on the family and what the IFSP process provides for families and why it's so important that the relationships are built at that level. IFSP statements that focus on the family include the requirement that we look at families' resources, priorities, and concerns related to enhancing their child's development. So it's so different than our IEP process, where looking at what a child needs is the focus and the function of developing services. Instead, we have to look at the entire family. We also have to look at measurable results or outcomes that are expected for both the child and that child's family. And sometimes the outcomes are far afield of the services provided to a child, but the outcomes are those things that help families maintain their child within the family structure and show progress. And then finally, the specific services are listed in an IEP that are to be provided, IFSP, that are to be provided to meet both the child and the family's needs. So this is a really revolutionary way that professionals now have to look at how do we serve a family so that they are able to maintain, stabilize, and help their child show the kind of progress that will allow them to have a life outside the family once they're grown. Family-directed outcomes are not by themselves the only thing we look at. But let's take a look at this example. A physical or occupational therapist wants to help strengthen Sam's back muscles so he can sit up. So the physical therapist is going to demonstrate and teach Mrs. Brown some exercises that she can do with Sam to help strengthen his back muscles. And the outcome of that is that eventually Sam will learn to sit up. Now, is that a family-specific outcome or is it a child outcome? Well, clearly, Sam sitting up is a child outcome. But what is the family outcome? It will be that Mrs. Brown now has more time that she can spend with other children in the family because she doesn't have to constantly hold Sam or carry him around because he's unable to sit on his own. So the family will define what it is they want. This process is simple and it's elegant. And while we as professionals are looking at how do we measure progress in a child, the family is looking at what are the benefits to us if our child is able to make this kind of progress that seems to be so important to all of us. Imagine that you went to dinner in a stranger's home, that something happened and you had to stay at a home of someone that you didn't know, somebody you'd never met before. Would they know that you're a vegetarian? Would you know if they like wine with their dinner? Would you know if they dress informally or formally for meals? You know, if you knew these things, the person you were visiting would be able to meet your needs and you'd be able to meet their needs. How would knowing these things help you? Well, it would help you by helping you avoid breaching cultural boundaries. The more we know about all families, the more likely we are able to avoid breaching boundaries. So if you knew that your family were non-drinkers, you wouldn't bring wine. You might bring flowers instead. If you knew that your family was conservative, you wouldn't show up in shorts. So there are many little things which unintentionally may offend another person, which when we learn about that person, we're much less likely to practice. And culture is just like that. The more we know about a family, the more we know about their likes, their dislikes, their child-rearing practices, their educational level, the more likely we will be able to build the relationship by avoiding breaching these boundaries that seem to offend people, to make a good impression from the start, and to build a lifetime of service commitment that family can participate in. For me, one of the best and easiest ways of doing this is to help families understand and build on the things they're already good at. Building on family strengths recognizes the strengths that families already have, and it affirms the legitimacy of what they're already doing with their own child and their other children. It also helps support them to make their own decisions based on their family's needs. One of the mistakes I think we make is not helping families to understand their own strengths. This doesn't come automatically to us. If I were to sit down and ask you, give you a piece of paper and say, tell me, what are the things you really don't do well, and then what are the things you do well, the side of the paper would probably be much more full of the things that you don't do well. because we're so accustomed to focusing on deficits. Building on strengths, on the other hand, simply ignores some of the deficit areas in order to find the things that people are really, really good at. So what kind of questions help us uncover the strengths of families, particularly diverse families? Well, one of the things is to find out, what do parents think about their child's disability or developmental delay or problem, however the parents express it. What do they think about it? What do they think about their role in helping their child? Too often people have come here from other cultures who believe that the professionals know more about the needs of children than they do, and helping them understand and recapture that idea that they're competent and capable is a critical role of early childhood professionals. And what do families think about their role in services? Some parents think they should turn the child over to you, but that means they give away all their power in addition to their decision-making abilities. We don't want that. What do parents want their child to learn, their individual child? What does a family do? What do the parents do that makes a child happy? What do they see as the biggest challenges confronting their family as a result of their child's problems? And what do they want from you? What do they think early intervention ought to be providing to them? By focusing on what the parents' expectations are, we can help guide the discussions about ways of reaching these anticipated family outcomes. What do parents admire most about their child? Sometimes we may think that parents have unrealistic sets of expectations for their child's achievements. But really, for a very long time, if you had a child with a disability, we had unrealistically low expectations. So far better to create expectations that a child has to reach for. Far better for us as professionals, far better for the family. What do parents celebrate as cultural events in their community? Or are they connected to their community's culture? What is it they enjoy doing in the community? What do they see as their own strengths? What do they see as the strengths of their children? What do they do for fun? How does the family relax? These are just basic questions that you can ask a family in an indirect or direct style, depending on what's working for you. What do they do right now that's working for their child? Families do a tremendous amount for their children. And if you can tie into that, you can also help develop an IFSP that uses their strengths. What do they have as goals for this child? What do they want their other children to do? What do they hope their entire family is going to be doing in 5 years? What do they think this child will be doing in 5 years? This can give you an idea of the direction the family's headed, so that you can align your goals for the child to the direction the family is seeking. How do you build on the strengths of families? What can you as a professional do? First of all, you can reinforce the strengths of every person that is at the IFSP meetings. Identify them. Write them down. My suggestion, my strong suggestion, is that you begin to identify people by name and write down the things that they're good at, because it may be your role to remind them when they've forgotten. Validate parents for their own contribution to their child's development, because so many of our families don't realize the importance of these skills and the importance of what they've provided for their own child. Incorporate their strengths, the parent and family strengths, in developing IFSP goals and activities. Make sure that parents see themselves reflected in how the IEP is written. And follow up those home visits with strength-based phone calls. What's an example of a strength-based phone call? Is to remind someone, wow, we really think you've done such a good job with Johnny. And it's interesting to see how the other children gather around and support him when you're there. Let people know this, because that may not be happening in other parts of their life. Let's take a look at preparing for the IFSP meeting. What are those things that you can do that will make the IFSP go better, particularly for families from diverse cultures? Well, we probably already know that we should call parents before the visit. And if parents don't have a phone, and many of our families don't, mail the information and include your phone number. It's kind of neat if you can also include a picture of yourself, so that when you show up at the home, families have an idea of who you are and what you look like. It's helpful to know that sometimes making that very first phone call is the most difficult part of the IFSP process for families. To have to reach out to someone else and say, I need help with a problem within my own family is a very difficult thing for some of our parents. These typical challenges that all parents face are often compounded by differences in language, by differences in culture, and by differences in tradition within the family. The first contact with this early childhood system, which makes your role so vital, gives the opportunity for families to see this process as very positive and very responsive to them and their needs. If the caregivers have a phone, call them. Explain the purpose of the meeting. Explain what the expected outcome of the meeting is going to be. If you need to do this in person, do it in person. If you do it by mail, be sure that what you put on paper, especially if it's in English, is simple enough for the family to understand. Remember that systems, as we know them in America, are not the same systems that were in the countries that many of our immigrant families came from, and the systems in other countries may have done things to rather than for or with the families that they were in their charge. Let them know who's going to participate. What are their names? What are their roles? What will they do? Be sure to discuss the family's role very, very thoroughly and help them understand how they will be expected to participate throughout this entire meeting, because their role is so valuable. Find the best days and times of day for parents to meet, considering the schedule of others. You know, one of the interesting things for me is going into a family's home when the Price is Right is on. May not be the best time to meet. And we can't go in and say you need to turn your television set off, because if it's something a parent does on a daily basis, then it's probably not appropriate. So ask those kinds of questions. What is a good time? Can we meet quietly? If you find that the living room space that people want to meet in is too loud, but other children are watching TV, you can't say, turn off the TV, I'm working with this child. You can say, can we find a quieter space? And that would be perfectly appropriate to do. Sometimes it's helpful just to schedule the meeting during a sibling's nap time, so the other small children in the family are sleeping or engaged in quiet activities. You're also going to need to schedule around cultural and religious observations and holidays. In some Muslim homes, for instance, parents may need a break during the meeting for scheduled prayer time. We should never ask a parent to give up a scheduled time for an important family activity in order to participate in an IFSP meeting unless there are simply no other options available. And understand that prayer time is going to be more important for some families than an IFSP, which has its reward at the long end of a year or two of work, and the prayer has an immediate and important reward. There are many communities that have elders or spiritual leaders or healers that families use for guidance and direction before any decision-making, any important family decision-making takes place. Begin to ask those questions. Who do you rely on for decision-making? Are there other people who help you make these decisions? Are there other people you think should be invited to the IFSP meeting? And don't expect that the people they might want to invite are blood relatives. That's simply not always true. There are people who may not come to the meeting at all, but who will still make the decisions that affect a family. So sometimes people need time to take the information back from an IFSP meeting to ask other people in their community, elders, grandparents, relatives, non-relatives, other caregivers, or people they turn to for advice before making the decision. Understand that this is okay. It's fine. And these people should be invited to the meeting if that's what the family desires. So you want to address this carefully, because you don't want to offend people by saying, who else makes decisions for your family? Remember that indirect communication style and refer back to it as often as is necessary for you to get a clear understanding. Many families from other cultures show respect by offering food or refreshment for guests. In fact, some will prepare food specifically for the IFSP meeting. If you are not able to accept food at a meeting or refreshments, please let people know before the visit in an informal way. Sometimes they will spend the only money they have left in their kitty for food for the month in order to make sure that your needs are met. So if you're going to turn it down, be sure to let people know that ahead of time, that you're coming at 2. You'll have had lunch by then, so you don't need any food. Or you can bring a bottle of water with you so the family sees that your needs are met. But don't just walk into a home if you're at all able to avoid it and refuse refreshments that have been offered to you, because that's considered very disrespectful in some cultures. And I know this is tough for some people because you really do show up and you're not hungry, but you need to let people know that as much in advance as possible. You need to find out as soon and as early in the process as possible if the family needs an interpreter. Do not assume that if a family speaks English, they're not going to want or not going to need an interpreter, or even that all family members speak English, or whether the family's comprehension of English is very deep. So ask whether they prefer the written information in English or in the primary language if it is not English. A final caution here is please don't ask family members, especially children, to translate for the family, if at all possible. And part of the reason for that is people don't like necessarily bringing bad news to the rest of the family. And part of the reason is that for children especially, some of the information may not be respectful for them to be the ones to convey to a family. So family members tend to overstate or sometimes understate information that's emotional. And it may not be appropriate for the person doing the translating. And sometimes we simply like to soften information that we give to our other family members. So be careful with that. And if language is a barrier and no interpreters around, despite your best efforts, try to build understanding in any way you can, but keep the meeting information very general until you can get an interpreter to develop more specific approaches. It's really important. Even when the family speaks English, don't assume they can read at the level of many public agency documents. Many parents won't be able to understand an IFSP. This has nothing to do with their intelligence, but it has a great deal to do with their unfamiliarity with systems in general and their unfamiliarity with formal language that is used in documents. Above all, help parents understand their critical role in services and supports. Many will not know what their role should be, especially if they come from a different culture where the expectation is that the professional is the expert. They won't understand what an equal partnership means. They won't understand necessarily that they are the people who should be driving the services to their child, because authority for decisions have always remained with professionals in other cultures. Very often this has happened. In many cultures, the group interests, which is to say the group interests being the IFSP participants, is paramount to their individual interests for their child. So this is not a good place necessarily to talk about rights, because rights that protect the child are not as important as the rights to protect the interdependence of the group. So you're going to run into lots of times families who believe that building relationships and having group interdependence is more important than the outcomes for an individual child. Often, finding rapport and finding ways to agree is more important to families than individual rights. And they will sacrifice those rights or not value those rights unless they first feel that the rights of the group to genuine, friendly interdependence is first upheld. So that's really an important consideration. So getting along is really, really important for many families. Be sure when you end the IFSP meeting to explain what's going to happen next for the child and the family. Give families a phone number, encourage them to call, and on a really positive note, make this meeting end happy. Praise the child, praise a family's strength, thank parents for their participation, thank them for their critical role, thank them for their valuable input. Make sure that when you leave that meeting, that family is anxious to come to the next one. We don't want to lose them after the first meeting. Okay, let's deal with some specific strategies for working with families. Effective IFSP meetings occur when we greet each family personally. And I know that sometimes this breaches people's ideas about maintaining professional boundaries. But the more personal information you're willing to share about yourself, the more families will be willing to share about themselves with you. In some cultures, that reciprocity is an expectation to building a relationship. So if there are things you can't share, well, of course you're not going to. But let them know if you're a parent. Let them know if you have children. Let them know why you entered this business that you're in. Let them know what you enjoy about working with early childhood. Explain why you're there. And there's some things you can know that will help you a great deal. You need to know whether you're entering a culture where your expectation is that you should meet and greet the males before the females. In some cultures, this is an expectation. If you don't know that, then direct your response to both parents and let the family express another preference if they have one, or find a way to ask that question. It's not going to be unusual when you enter a family, especially a family from a diverse background, to have all sorts of extended family members present in the room, because people are vitally interested in what happens to the children within their culture, or in their clan, or in their family. These may or may not be blood relatives, by the way. They're just family. And family, because it's defined so differently by different cultures, can include whoever the family decides is family. And the parents, of course, should decide who gets involved and who gets invited. Now, this point is really important, and I want you to pay attention to it, because no matter how you personally feel about any cultural practice that's different from your own, showing deference to males, for instance, over females in a meeting, you must be willing, you have to be willing to be open and receptive to the differences. We're not saying you have to agree. We're not saying that you have to believe that this is a correct or appropriate way to build a life, but you have to be willing to enter into a new cultural exchange in order to serve a family effectively. And so if you're in a family that is male-dominated and you have to pose all of your questions to males, whether you're male or female, don't feel bad about it. Just understand that you have the opportunity for new cultural learning that will enable you to be a better professional as you go down this interesting road of working with diversity. If you don't understand anything about the parents' culture, you might want to call a cultural center within the community that serves this group. Tell them about yourselves. Tell them how much you want to build partnerships with families. Ask them what the potential pitfalls are. Let them know that you're anxious to be accepted into the community, that you want to serve, and that you want to do so respectfully. You're going to find lots of answers coming your way when people genuinely believe that you want to help members of their culture. Explain this process as carefully as possible to the family. You're probably going to have to explain it more than once. Not only is the IFSP a relatively complicated process for an American who speaks English, it also is a process that involves multiple systems that may not have existed in this parent's culture or may have existed in a negative way within their culture. So explain the process and help them understand that they're in the driver's seat. Keep in mind that there's a real need for families to begin to understand the structure of education, the structure of social services, the structure of health, and what their roles in these systems are, including the terminology used within those systems. We cannot expect parents, anyone, new immigrant parents in particular, but any parent, to know the systems or the terminology the way that we do as professionals. Describe the process, invite questions, repeat this process more than once. If you see people beginning to falter in subsequent meetings, re-explain the process, re-explain the family role, because it may take some time for them to begin to understand their particular role in making the IFSP work. Be really sensitive to the family's emotional states. If I had my way, I would eliminate the term "you should" from the English language. I believe that it is inherently a disrespectful term to tell a parent, you should work with your child 3 times a week. Instead, we have to be able to use terms that are less emotion-laden, like children have better progress when families are able to work with them 3 times a week. But the "you should" gets out of this. because it comes with a great deal of emotion and a great deal of feeling. If I feel like someone is directing me to do something because I've done it wrong, I'm going to be upset. You have to also expect some families are going to say there's nothing wrong with their child. It's not your role to argue with them or to say in America this is a disability, but you need to acknowledge, okay, I can understand that. I see what your feelings are, and begin to work on the relationship. So at some point the parent's able to hear you. And even if you know this child has lifelong problems, it isn't your decision to make. So let them know. Give them options. Give them choices. Give them suggestions, but not direction. Reinforce the value of their participation. I cannot tell you how often using the term rights with families is simply a turn off. As in our society in general, people like to know that they have rights. I have the right to speak up. I have the right to go to court. I have the right to have an IEP. I have a right to an IFSP. But some cultures, the term rights really relates to the individual. And we're talking about now the value of family participation. So instead of using that word rights, help families to understand how highly their role is valued in America, how much we value the input of parents, and how critical it is to the progress of children. Then later you can explain rights as this is the structure we have in place for helping us reach agreement. And it's really a way that we can use to honor the knowledge of families. It's not that parents don't need to know that they have rights. Of course they do. But it isn't about rights, it's about services. And if we can begin to help families understand that rights is simply a way to get at their absolutely vital role in services, I think that's probably more helpful than handing them a sheet of rights, which I know you will do anyway. But the focus shouldn't be rights, the focus should always be services. Some parents are going to be reluctant to have their children identified for early intervention services if you can't see the disability. There could be shame involved in this. There might be denial involved in it. A strategy is not to sit down and say, but your child does have a disability. The strategy is to take the time, work on the relationship so that parents become increasingly comfortable with decisions and how decisions are made. Allow enough time, and I know this is difficult for people whose caseloads are too high, but allowing enough time in the process early on for families to begin to make decisions in a way that makes sense to them saves you time in the long run because the trust is established. And the ability of a person to tell you, no, you're wrong, or the ability of a person to tell you, I don't agree with that, will be greatly enhanced, which shortens the time later on. Well, one of the things I run into constantly is some families are simply afraid they're going to be judged for the appearance of their home or for their parenting skills. I will never forget being in San Diego one year where a wonderful early childhood specialist went to a family's home for the first time. This was a Hmong family, a Hmong immigrant family, and knocked at their door. The family lived in a garage. And one of the first things the early intervention specialist said to them at their meeting was, gosh, one of the first things we have to do for you is find you decent housing. This is a family that had spent years in the camps in Thailand, had never had a nice place. This garage was their very best home ever, and they were very proud of it. But not knowing that, the early intervention specialist simply looked at their living situation and said, oh, this isn't up to, the American standard. It's not good enough. The family disappeared. They disappeared from the early intervention system, and they moved out of their garage because they were afraid of being followed. And so it's really, really, really important to understand that some families are really afraid you're going to judge them for how their home looks or for their parenting skills that they use. So if they are very unwilling to meet in their home, meet outside. Meet in another appropriate setting. Meet wherever you have to meet to get them started. Sometimes families are reluctant to invite company into a situation they feel will reflect on them. So many diverse families are wary of strangers in their home, which makes it doubly important that you build the relationship. If you can show up without a clipboard at that first meeting, that probably will help, because the clipboard is often the sign of authority. And I think it's interesting that working with these families is so simple, and the mistakes we make are so tiny, and they grow into large mistakes only because we haven't taken the time to think about it. So build the relationship. In some Somali and Asian homes, shaking hands, especially across genders, female to male, is simply not done. So sometimes it's just better not to initiate a handshake unless the parent extends their hand first. Their belief system may affect physical contact. Try to start and end the meeting as scheduled. One of the things that often happens is that when meetings run long, parents don't want to appear rude, so they let the meeting go on, even though that means their children will be fed late. They won't have time to prepare the evening meal or the midday meal, and they don't want to interrupt even if they have something else to do. So be sure to time those meetings so that they begin and end on time. And on time in this case is at the time that you have allotted for the meeting to take place. In some Asian homes, you'll find that families will use both Western and Eastern medicine. This is a tremendous opportunity for you to help families see themselves reflected in the IFSP, because if they use both Western and Eastern medicine practices, it can be incorporated into the IFSP. In Native American homes, traditional healing practices are often combined with Western medicines. So when you see parents who use massage, and a good line of inquiry will reveal to you what parents are doing with their children. When they use massage or smudging or cupping or any other healing practice, consider that intervention when you are planning and writing the IFSP. It will give parents a great deal of power to know that what they're doing is appropriate for their child within their culture. It's really important that we not make judgments about child rearing practices across cultures because they're really different. We typically tend to like our kids to run through the mud and get wet under the sprinklers or let them play in the sand, but that's not going to be true of everybody. So in terms of play, is playing in the sand or mud or water really a valuable sensory experience where the child can explore their world, or is it simply a messy consequence because the child only has 3 outfits, or because being dirty in a culture isn't valued? How do you know these things? You will know them only if you ask questions. When do children begin independent toileting? In some families, training pants or pull-ups are never used. And so what we think about is this sort of regimented way to teach toileting skills simply is not used in other cultures, and that's not wrong. It's just different. What's the expected age for the first steps of a child? Do parents expect their child to walk at 1? 2? Is it okay that they carry their child around for a long time before they begin walking? Are children expected to wear shoes when they learn to walk? Do they walk barefoot? It's interesting to me because sometimes physical therapists prefer that children learn to walk barefoot, and the families prefer that their children wear shoes. And that may be an expression of a culture, or it may be embedded in an experience in another country. For instance, if walking barefoot in soil that yields great parasites that it could be potentially dangerous to a child, it would be considered poor parenting to allow a child to walk barefoot. And so if you believe that walking barefoot is a really important step, help the family understand that it's perfectly safe, that in this country, in their lawn or in their yard, it's perfectly safe to do that, or in their home. But understand these practices if you can. Ask the questions. Take the time. When does a child first use words? Cannot tell you the number of Native American children who've been referred for speech and language services early because the family's preference for the use of language isn't the same as it is in the majority culture, and children speak much later. Is early language encouraged? Where does a child sleep? For how long does a child sleep? Who does a child sleep with? When does the child stop nursing or using a bottle? When do they begin to eat solid foods? When do they feed themselves independently? And how independent are other children in the family? What you'll find in some families are that the older children take care of the younger ones, carry them around, feed them, and are in turn carried around and fed by the family. So that may not be the most important thing you do. Discuss and discover how parents perceive their own child's future. They may have very different images of that child than you carry. They may have different beliefs about their child's success as an adult. They may have different thoughts about what services would be useful. You have to understand that how parents socialize children are embedded in their culture. For example, there was a sample of low-income Latino mothers in Chicago who said that they thought encouraging young children to read or write before they started to school was inappropriate and would interfere with school learning. Books were considered treasured possessions and deliberately kept out of the reach of young children. So even though you may have a value that children be exposed to books early, you have to understand that not everybody is going to have the same expectations about children, their development, and or their future. I love this one, because when we begin to explore the learning differences for a young child, some of the questions you want to know are, what could other children in the family do that this child cannot do at the same age? And if a parent had a dream that came true for their child, what would their child be doing differently, if anything? Sometimes the label of disability creates negative expectations because the families haven't been exposed to the idea of interventions that reduce its effects. They may believe their child has no disability, or they may not even experience or express these fears. So dream questions can help parents begin to understand the discrepancy, if one exists, between their child's current performance and the family's dream. When parents believe that what they know is valued and valuable, they'll be able to carry out strategies that allow them to reduce this discrepancy. And finally, in this section here, open-ended questions really encourage conversation. And so the kind of questions that are valuable to families are things like, I really want to be helpful. Is there anything I can learn about your community or your culture that would help me do a better job with your child? Or help me understand what resources you've found helpful in your community. This also taps into parental expertise and allows them to be in charge of their own meeting. Check often to see if parents understand what you're saying. Questions like, do you understand, may often receive a head nod or a yes response, even when they don't understand. No one wants to lose face, particularly when they're meeting with professionals around their child. So try a different way. Does this sound right to you? Does this sound like your child? Can you tell me what you think of this idea? Do you have any idea what you can do next for your child? Sometimes are much more successful than asking people whether they understand what you're saying. Focus on services that benefit the whole family. How does helping a child learn to sit unaided benefit the entire family? Is independent skill development for a child important to the entire family? And this one may be the most important of all. Successes, a child's growth, a child's development have to be celebrated as family achievements. You want the family to own a child's achievements because it helps build confidence and knowledge, helps families take care of their own, helps them reduce the future need for formal services because they will know what it is they can do that helps their child grow. Section 5 is called Check in Your Skills, and these are just questions, and they're not things I'm going to give you answers to. Rather, they're things you can reflect on. First of all, what shall I call you? We tend to want to look at people who are black and call them African American. But look at, in Minnesota, how many different African nationals live here. So what should I call you? How will I know? Would the family prefer African American, black, or country of origin? How do you know? Should I call you Native American? Should I call you Hispanic or Latino? How do you know? If you learn the answers to these questions, please write them down because it's so easy to forget when you have more than one family you're working with. Do I share information in words that parents can hear and understand? Often families don't know words or use them, like developmental delay or disability. They may say their child has a problem, or they may say that their child is slow. Take the lead from families in the terms you use. What can you do to be sure that the language you use is understood by the family? Do I really listen to parents and families? I cannot tell you how many times as an advocate, parents have called me and said, I told this to the teacher, but they didn't listen. How can you show parents and families that you have listened, that you have heard? What can you do to be sure that each family you work with feels that what they contribute is heard? Is it written down? Does it need to be written down? Does it need to be repeated to them? Do you really listen? How can you show it? Do I ask families what they want to do about their concerns for their young child? Remember, it's the skills and strengths of families that will help them gain expertise in helping their child with a disability. What can you do to be sure that families are comfortable expressing opinions and making suggestions? This doesn't happen overnight. It may not happen in a week. It may not happen in a month. But it will eventually happen if you're there with them, helping them understand that their concerns are what drives the IFSP process. How can you show that you support their decisions even if you don't agree? You cannot insist that a family get occupational therapy if they don't think their child needs it. How can you support their decisions even if you don't personally agree? Do I look for and spend time building on the strengths of families? Not one of us likes to be told over and over again about our failings. But most of us really appreciate others who tell us more than once what they think we do really well. What can you do to help families understand and use their strengths? I have to say that many families don't understand that they have strengths. They will speak about their child in deficit ways because that's what they've been taught and that's what they've learned. How can you understand how to help them recapture what they do well and to use what they do well in developing the IFSP? Do I provide options instead of advice? Now this is back to that eliminating you should from your vocabulary. Options give parents a pool of resources from which to choose. You have a great deal of useful information for a family. You went to school. You trained for this field because it's what you wanted to do. At the same time as you have all this information, many families want choices for their families as opposed to direct instruction about what they do and need to do. Most do not want advice. They want options from which they can choose. So how can you help them understand it's their role to make their own choices about their own child's life and to get them engaged in the conversation about exercising those choices? Do I use language that's positive and hopeful? One of the things I've learned over time is that people who are treated as if they have the skills to solve their own issues usually find ways to solve them. There's a great power in feeling competent and capable, and you have a tremendous role in helping build the confidence, the competence, and the capacity of families to build on their own hope and optimism and their own abilities to do for their own family. Do I understand the special issues confronting new immigrant parents of young children? What brought them to America? Were services available in their home country? What are their expectations for early intervention services? In their own country, what was their role, if they had a role? What questions can you ask, and how should you ask them, to help you understand the needs and strengths of new arrivals on these shores? How will you go about asking those questions, and what are the kinds of questions you need to know answers to in order to support family decision making? A final note. What early childhood professionals in a family have in common is the development and health of a young child. It actually goes beyond that because it's the development and health of a family. Building these partnerships, especially with diverse families, but truly with all families, can help them acquire skills to help their child and family do for themselves. Partnerships are never easy, especially when they cross belief systems, especially when they transcend value systems, but they yield such tremendous rewards and opportunities for learning for both families and for those who serve families. We want to be overt in our thank you for what you do for families in Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Dixie. I want to mention that there is an expanded version of the curriculum Dixie just presented, and it is posted on the website as a PowerPoint. So those of you who found this helpful, which I would imagine is all of you, may want to download and check out the additional information that you would find in the full version of the PowerPoint. Thanks again, Dixie. Next, we're going to move to our panel discussion from our multicultural advocates. And PACER is really fortunate to have this team of experienced multicultural parent advocates. Many of them have been here for quite some time and bring a lot of experience as well as expertise and skills. The multicultural advocates provide individual assistance to parents through phone calls and home visits. They conduct workshops for parents and professionals, and they develop and translate family-friendly materials and resources in languages that families can understand. One thing you can do as a professional is if you're working with a family, you may want to refer the parent to PACER if they need help from an understanding parent advocate who is familiar with their culture and can bridge the gap between complex service systems and the family. And so feel free to refer families to the advocates that are going to share in this presentation today. One of the things in developing materials and strategies for this parent outreach project that we engaged in was that each advocate received input from the families of young children in Minnesota from their culture regarding the family's personal experiences in trying to address their concerns about their child's development and in accessing help. And ask some questions about what was helpful to them in the process and what was challenging. And one thing to keep in mind as the advocates are sharing today is that we're not saying that working effectively with families from diverse cultures means you need to become a cross-cultural expert, but what it does do is require you to just be more intentional and thoughtful in your communication with parents and families. And the more different you are culturally from a family, the more intentional you'll need to be in your communication and interaction with the family. So the advocates want to share some practical tips about how you can do that, how you can be more intentional. They're each going to take a few minutes to share some tips based on their own experiences with some particular families they've worked with. And I want to remind you that while they're sharing, if you have additional questions, to email those in, and then we will be asking them to address those questions. You can address questions to a particular person or to the panel as a whole. So we're going to start with Lucy Favorite. And Lucy has worked at PACER as an advocate and a coordinator of the American Indian Project for 8 years. She works with families that have children identified with disabilities or who are considered at risk. Lucy provides services to the Indian community in the 7-county metro area, as well as serving the 11 Indian reservations in Minnesota. Lucy is an enrolled member of the White Earth Indian Reservation and the parent of 4 children, including children with disabilities. So Lucy, we'd like to start with you. Would you please share some of your tips with us today?
Thank you, Barb. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. And I would like to start by saying that historically for Indian families, there has been mistrust when working with professionals, and therefore keep in mind when building a relationship with the families that you are providing services to, and that you'll have to look at building a relationship with your families, and this will not be done automatically, but it will be done over time. And another important thing to remember is that for some individuals, learning may not have been easy for them, and it may be difficult for them to ask for help. And I know, as Dixie said, that it's important to let them know a little bit about you. When working with parents, I always let them know that I'm a parent and that I have children myself with disabilities. It's important to let families know that what you can expect, what they can expect from you. Would you be their primary contact? How can they reach you? Are you available to attend meetings? Let them know what you can expect from them. Provide resources available to them whenever possible. Be able to provide resources that are Indian specific. And one of the things that I like to share with people is that over the years when I've worked in the community, I've been able to build relationships with families, and they have trusted me and they still call me. In working with families, ask the parent how they want to be addressed. And the reason I say this is that many have nicknames. So therefore, when encountering a family, you're not going to so much call somebody Mr. or Mrs., but a lot of people have nicknames, and that could be for a child or an adult. Indian people are very quiet and very private people, And I know it was mentioned earlier, and at times it may be easier to meet at a neutral location such as a community center. Another thing to keep in mind is that confidentiality is very important. I have often heard it said that in the Indian community, it is like a fishbowl because everybody knows you or they know your family. In a former job, I worked as a foster care and adoption worker. During a training session, a coworker and I were providing the referral process from the county and tribes, and a coworker had taken the referral form, and what she had done is taken whiteout and she had put it over the children's name and any other identifying information. However, there was still enough identifying information that when we went on break, I had an elder come up to me, and she said that the referral we used, she was able to identify that it was her grandchildren. And she shared that she was granted an emergency license from the county, and she had come to us to go for a full license because she was looking at taking her grandchildren into her home. Another thing is that the parents that I work with here at Pacer sometimes will ask me why I'm asking information, and a lot of times it's for statistical purposes. So just be very careful when gathering information and let them know what you're using it for, and that the people that you're working with are just very private. And I think one other thing that I'll share, Barb, before I close is that I know that when I came to Pacer Center to get help for my son many years ago, when Pacer returned my call, my mom had taken the call and told me that Pacer called and was inquiring as to why they were calling. And I told her why I called, and she sat me down and talked to me, and she said that I shouldn't be asking people for help. And what this makes me think of is that I was taught as a little girl that we are not to share our problems outside the home. And with that, what I'm going to do is turn it back over to Barb.
Thanks, Lucy. We really appreciate your input. Next, we're going to hear from Hassan Samantar. Hassan is a parent advocate and trainer and the Somali parent advisor at Pacer. He translates materials for parents into Somali. He conducts workshops for professionals on culturally sensitive issues and works with families in a variety of ways, including projects with technical assistance and allies for parent centers in other Somali communities in greater Minnesota. Hassan is also the parent of a child with a health impairment. Hassan, could you share some tips with us, please?
Thank you, Barb. Good morning to all the participants. I think it's important to have a good relationship with any family, regardless of their background or ethnicity. However, I would like to point out a few things that would help professionals getting off to a good start, especially when working with Somali families. Dixie has talked about some of these things, but would like to emphasize a few of them. In Somali culture, families value the relationship they have with professionals. So taking some time to get to know each other and converse with the family before the meeting starts is a good way to start not only the meeting and a good way to have that first impression. Even when you are pressed for time, it's very essential to devote some time to conversation and activities that will help to build trust into the relationship. The other one that I would like to point out is when professionals use an interpreter to communicate with the family. Do not assume that just because the interpreter and the family came from the same country, they will understand each other easily. Sometimes they might have come from different parts of their country and speak different dialects. So it's a good idea to have the family and the interpreter meet in advance. It could be some time before the meeting or the day before as well. It's also a good idea to sit down with your interpreter and go over the materials you want him or her to interpret. There are a lot of technical words that either do not have a meaning or do not make sense when translated into Somali language. Good example of this is the word disability itself. Disability is viewed as someone who is physically disabled or cognitively delayed, and it's widely believed to be a result of a family curse, and it carries, of course, a stigma. It will not be unusual for a parent to initially say, there's nothing wrong with my child, acknowledge their viewpoint, and recognize it may take time to develop enough trust in the relationship for the parent to really hear and consider your point or your input. Therapists who specialize in culturally sensitive treatment say there is a delicate balance between discussing the problems in a way that encourages those who need help to seek it, and drawing unwanted attention to immigrants who already feel stigmatized and vulnerable. Keep also in mind confidentiality is a new idea for a lot of immigrants, and nor do they trust or believe what they say won't be repeated. Therefore, by briefing your interpreter in advance, it gives him or her not only the chance to bond relationship with the family, but also to find a meaningful way to translate or to rephrase some of your questions differently. And lastly, in a Muslim homes, as Dixie mentioned earlier, parents may need to take a break during the home meeting to observe regularly scheduled prayer times. So ask the family, when is the appropriate time to break the meeting? Or coordinate with your interpreter. It's a good way to have it in place before the meeting. Thank you, Barb.
Thank you, Hassan. I know that everyone will appreciate how practical those tips are and how they can be implemented in their work. Next, we're going to hear from Bonnie Jean Smith. Bonnie Jean has been a parent advocate and trainer and multicultural specialist at the Pacer Center for 9 years. She has served as a member of the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities and as a quality director for IFSP Inc. She's also served as a State of Minnesota Quality Indicator Business Team member for Minneapolis Public Schools Overview and serves as an evaluator for the Minnesota Council of Quality. Her past professional experience includes case management at Women's Advocate Inc., a battered women's shelter, and as an educator at the Early Learning Center at the Phillips Community Initiatives for Children. She's recently published her first book, How Big is the Fly? Asking the Right Questions. Bonnie Jean is also the parent of 2 children with developmental disabilities. Bonnie Jean, can you share some tips for interactions, please?
Yes. Hello, and thank you for attending today. My name is Bonnie Jean Smith, and I am African American. To look at me, you could not know I grew up in Europe and the United States. I always mention this fact about myself to remind us not to make assumptions based on appearance. I have 4 children, 2 which have Asperger's, meaning they learn on the autism spectrum. You must remember that every single family has a different culture, even if they have the same ethnicity. Some families are loud, some families are not. When visiting a family in my community, it is very important to share history about yourself and why you chose the profession that you chose. It is very important, if you do not understand something you have seen or heard while at a home visit, not to make assumptions. Simply ask for clarification. This will show that your willingness to understand how the family functions. It will show that you are the parents, that you are open and willing to learn about their child. Affirm what parents have been doing with their child and put it into the context of what services you will be providing. Remember, the parents are going to be ready for you to, quote-unquote, judge them and their home. When building relationships with African American families, within your entire initial contact process, stay transparent. Always check for understanding, not just by asking, do you understand, which you'll probably just get a yes to. It's important to repeat initial contact information, perhaps have important information highlighted because this is new for the parents. An example, state over and over during your intake, this is your contact person if you have any questions, concerns, or if you need to reschedule for any reason. Example, I made a flat refrigerator magnet with contact information and a place on there where I could take a permanent marker and write the name of the contact person. This will not only build your relationship with the family you're currently working with, but it will help you build your organization's capacity in the community. And I learned this while assisting a family that had many identified needs. I refer them to available resources, things that you can point out, ones that you know about, and special education services. This family ended up giving my business telephone number to numerous other families who had not been contacted, had not reached out for services before. In the African American community, when addressing an adult out of respect, children are taught to always use the terms Mr., Ms., Miss, or Ms. It's a sign of respect. You should always check with the family to see how they would prefer the other children in their family or how they want them to address you, and not assume that they're going to call you Tom, Angel, Mary, or anything else. Because this is a tradition in the African American community that stems from slavery times. To show each other respect, it's always Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so. Many of the parents that I work with today call me Miss Bonnie. And when they've done well, I call them Miss, Mr., and they love that. It's just reciprocal respect. In African American culture, there are persons who believe in inclusion and persons who believe in integration. Inclusion means living in a city or town that is not predominantly your ethnicity, but keeping your ethnic ways, example, your language, traditions, community, and values. Integration means living in a city or town that is not predominantly your ethnicity, and you take on the dominant culture's language, traditions, and community values. In the African American community, parents want to understand what you are saying, and they want to be treated with respect. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Bonnie Jean. I especially appreciate the idea of the magnet. As a parent of a young child myself who was identified, that would have been so helpful to have such a handy phone number. We're going to go next to Jesus Villaseñor, and Jesus has been a multicultural specialist and a parent advocate and trainer for PACER for 12 years. He assists Hispanic families in obtaining information and services for educational, medical, social, and recreational programs for their children with disabilities. He conducts workshops for families with limited English proficiency and gives presentations to professionals about identifying cultural barriers. He also translates publications. Jesus serves as a member of the board of directors of the Hispanic Latino Leadership Association. He has served as a representative on the Minnesota Special Education Advisory Panel, the LEP-IEP Cultural Advisory for the National Center on Educational Outcomes, and the Diversity Advocacy Advisory Committee of the Minnesota Department of Education. Also the Success by Six Cultural Dynamics Committee of the United Way, and as a national field reviewer for CLASS, the Cultural and Linguistic Appropriate Services Institute. Jesus is also the parent of an adult child with a learning disability. Jesus, we'd love to hear your comments.
Gracias, Barb. Buenos días a todos. The first thing that I would like the participants to know is that Hispanic/Latino families come from over 22 Spanish-speaking countries, from big cities and small farms. Some have come straight to Minnesota, and others live in other states of the country, and they end up in Minnesota with different degrees of acculturation. So please avoid assumptions based on ethnicity, because every family is different. Many professionals may have some apprehension in working with families of other cultures because they may be afraid of saying something culturally inappropriate. But as long as you use your social skills, you are caring, sincere, and compassionate, the families will open up to you. Once you get the trust of a Latino family, believe me, they trust you with everything. Make sure to greet every family member, say hello and goodbye. It is not advisable to hug anyone. A simple handshake will do, but it's not necessary. Your greeting should sound polite and sincere. Don't just get up and leave without saying goodbye, even if you don't want to interrupt. That is considered an insult. Before having a meeting with parents, think about what you're going to say, then cut it in half. Too much information isn't good communication. Ask yourself, what is the most important thing that parents need to know today? Of course, let the family know that if they have further questions, they can call you or get in touch with you through an interpreter. if necessary. Don't use professional jargon, as Dixie said. When discussing the child's disability, try to find a way to explain yourself in simpler terms and use examples as much as possible. Remember, very few people in this world have your specific knowledge and experience, so not everyone will understand terms as IFSP, PT, OT, etc. Please make sure to know the parent names and have the names in front of you during the visit. It is unacceptable to call a parent mom or dad, or in this case, mama or papa. If you are using an interpreter, be sure to spend some time discussing what the meeting is about beforehand. The interpreter may not be familiar with some of the terms you will be using, so please explain them. This may allow you to think about how you will express yourself better when you are with the family. And most important of all, although it may seem too obvious to mention, oftentimes professionals and other staff forget to state the purpose of a meeting or even to introduce themselves. Also, you must not forget to add that whatever you discuss is confidential and that you are prohibited from talking to any outside person, agency, or organization about the child and or the family. Many parents are concerned about issues relating to immigration, and understandably, they need to be reassured about confidentiality. This is specifically true in smaller cities. But before ending, I'd like to tell a little story about this mom that after the IFSP meeting said, it's wonderful and I feel grateful for all these people that are so serious and concerned about the disabilities of my child, but do they ever smile or laugh? And it dawned on me that of the team, she was the most joyous person and more uplifted, and she was the mom with a kid with severe disability. So my advice to you, if you enjoy working with families as much as I do, please don't be afraid to show it. It doesn't take professionalism away from you if you do that. Thank you. Thank you, Barb.
And thank you, Jesus. We sure appreciated your insights. Finally, we're going to hear from Dao Shang. And Dao is a parent advisor at Pacer Center, where he's been for 14 years, providing information and resources for Southeast Asian American families of children about their rights and responsibilities for their child's learning. He does this through workshops, personal assistance, and written and translated materials. Dao came to the United States as a refugee 28 years ago and is the parent of 7 children with, of course, extensive involvement in the school setting. His adult daughter has a mild cognitive developmental disability. Dao also participates with many organizations in an advisory role and in the Hmong community. Dao, we're ready to hear from you.
Thank you, Beth, and hello, everyone. I would like to add more what this has said earlier about parents' emotional feeling, taking service in and family environment. When there is a delay, many Hmong parents feel confused and guilty. As a mother said, what went wrong and why does it happen to my child? I don't know what to do, but just caress my child. They also feel frustrated about their child's future. A young father emotionally said, how will I meet my son's need? I always dreamed that he will now face many challenges as I do, but how will he do that with this condition? Many Hmong parents also go to a length of wait-and-see time and are reluctant to take resources in. Seeking outside help show a reluctance of parents' responsibility or the inability to raise the child. Even though many Hmong parents are aware of early childhood resources, they usually seek their own family and community resource first by consulting with family members, leaders, community healer, or church leader about the child's delay, and use traditional and herbal practice such as shaman, massage, or herbal medicine, or go to church to pray. They might pursue medical and psychological evaluation at the same time or later on. However, when they do, These services is best to help them understand the early childhood resource, the process, and the possible outcome, and provide the support they need to enable them to participate in the service planning and to have a positive experience of their first encounter with early childhood services. It is very important to focus on their strengths, value their contribution to their child's developmental progress, and incorporate any additional practice such as into OT or PT service plan. In this early stage, many Hmong parents are seeking help in high hope that the child's condition will be healed. When visiting or meeting with Hmong family, some may be capable to provide a quiet, clean room to meet, but many can only meet in a room they use for multiple purposes, where TV, sofa, baby crib, and toys are. The family might offer you a refreshment or a meal to show their hospitality and respect. This offer is also a means to establish relationship. They also highly value how you interact with them, and especially their child. Lastly, Hmong and other Asian community is very close-knit, so they recognize what I said earlier is about them and might offend them. Keep everything confidential is always what they desire. Thank you.
Thank you, Dow. And I want to remind everyone that you can email questions, follow-up questions to any of the advocates who just spoke, or questions to Dixie by using the bar, the webinar toolbox bar, and typing in your question, and we'll be receiving those. And at the conclusion of the webinar, we will begin addressing the questions, and we'll leave that extra half-hour additional time. If you do send questions today, because we have a large audience and they're not answered during the presentation, we will be posting questions and answers afterwards on our website. We're going to move to part 3 of our agenda, and we're right on time. This next part is going to take about 15 minutes, and we're going to do a practical exercise to kind of take what you've learned and apply it to a situation or setting you might encounter in your work. There are actually 2 case studies in your additional resources that you downloaded. If you didn't download them, you can do it afterwards. We're going to take you through one scenario today as a group, and then hopefully you'll be able to utilize the other one in your own in-service training. But I'd like to introduce Judy Sweat to you. Judy is our early childhood coordinator and has been a parent advocate at the Pacer Center for 12 years. She is the parent of an adult daughter with PDD-NOS, and Judy provides individual assistance to parents of young children with disabilities. She also designs and presents trainings to parents and early childhood professionals regarding early childhood special education services and inclusive child care practices. In addition, Judy is a trainer for Minnesota Project Exceptional and the Special Quest Project. She has served as the chair of the Minnesota Governor's Interagency Coordinating Council on Early Intervention and on the National Board for the Council for Exceptional Children. Judy currently serves on the advisory board for the Early Childhood Outcome Center and is a board member and president-elect for Minnesota Division of Early Childhood. We're really pleased to have Judy here to help us with this exercise.
Thanks, Barb. Good morning to all of you. If this had been a workshop, we probably would have taken a break somewhere in between so you could get up and move around a little bit. For those of you who have been tied to your desk, feel free to get up, stand up, move around, and sit back down again. You've heard from Dixie and the multicultural advocates on how to partner effectively for families from diverse cultures. These effective partnerships have elements of trust, friendship, and good communication. As you know, these elements are essential if we as professionals expect families to trust us with all the day-to-day inner workings of their lives. If we fail to establish these trusting relationships, it becomes difficult to write truly effective goals and outcomes on the IFSP. It is only as we partner with families that we will see early intervention services making a difference in the lives of the child and family. You can imagine, any of you in the audience, how you would feel if you were all of a sudden expected to share some of the intimate details of your lives, as we expect families to share with us. And so it becomes incredibly important that we really establish those trusting relationships with families. As Barb mentioned, we're going to use the case studies that were able to be downloaded as part of the presentation today. We're going to use the Guillermo family to practice writing child and family outcomes. The case studies had some more in-depth information than what we're going to talk about today, but let's begin. And I just can hear Jesus cringing every time I say Guillermo, because I don't pronounce it correctly the way I should, but I'm doing the best I can. This is what we learned about Marisol. She lives with her mother, Anna, 2 adult brothers, Roberto and David, and her children, Paul, age 30 months, Juan, age 8, and Sofia, age 9. Grandma Ana, Roberto, and David speak Spanish. Marisol, Juan, and Sofia speak English. Paul has Down syndrome. Juan and Sofia both have friends who speak only English. Marisol wants Paul to be able to speak English, and she's concerned that hearing 2 languages spoken in the house may confuse him. Marisol is also stressed by Paul's crying and needing to get housework done at the same time she's trying to get his needs met. Now, this is great information to have about the family, and it may have been things that you learned on your first visit, but it doesn't tell you much about what their concerns, needs, and priorities are that they want to work with on the IEP. In order to determine the outcomes for the family, we need to ask some more questions. Some of the things that we would want to know about is, what are the family's current concerns, needs, and priorities? We may have seen a lot of things as we walked into the house, and we may have in our own minds some things that we think the family or Paul needs to be working on. But as Dixie has said previously, this is a family-driven process, so we need to find out from the family what are their current concerns, needs, and priorities. How can you help the family to identify their preferred family outcomes? And what will the individuals do to help the family meet these desired outcomes once they've been identified? So once you've established a relationship with Marisol and her family, you might begin by asking her to talk about a typical day, maybe asking guiding questions to discover what's working and where there are concerns. As you do this, keep in mind the suggestions that you heard from Dixie and the other advocates, so Marisol will feel comfortable disclosing this personal information to you. Perhaps you'd begin by using a conversational style rather than just asking those pertinent questions. As Dixie mentioned earlier, sometimes those direct questions can be intimidating or for a family, and it may be hard for them to address them. But using a conversational style, the family may present more information to you. Then ask follow-up questions to the information that the family has volunteered. In a typical workshop, I think we would probably have you break up into small groups and read over the case study and perhaps do some role-playing as you try to come up with some ideas that the family might want to work on. But today we're going to take some shortcuts and provide the information that we have received from the family. During the family interview, Marisol shared the following concerns. There may have been many more, but we're going to assume that these are the concerns that the family placed as a priority. First of all, the family would like Paul to be able to express needs by talking instead of crying or pointing. We heard from Marisol that this was very stressful for the family to have him crying all the time. Marisol needs to know if Paul will be confused by hearing 2 languages being used in the home. Marisol would like Paul to learn to speak in English. Paul's family would like to feel less stress over meeting Paul's needs, because it's probably apparent that as Marisol's working, perhaps Grandma Anna or Roberto are helping to do the child care, and if they can't understand him, they also can't meet his needs. Marisol would like to have more time and energy to complete other household tasks and responsibilities. Once you've created this list of priorities, you take the next step and write them into goals or outcomes statements for the child and the family that will be transferred to the IFSP. So now we've sat down with Marisol and perhaps maybe changed the language around and put them into outcome statements. First one, Marisol will have the information she needs to make decisions about which language or languages family members will use with Paul. Anna, Roberto, and David will become more familiar with English words Paul may use to ask for books, toys, milk, and basic foods. As I said earlier, it sounds like these are the people who are providing the child care for David while Marisol is at work. So it is important to involve them in helping to Paul use English words as well. Paul will learn and use basic words to ask for what he needs or wants instead of crying, whining, or pointing. And then, of course, Marisol and the family will experience less stress and anxiety in the home, and hopefully Marisol will be better able to complete household tasks. You'll note that the priorities that Marisol has identified are impacted by the language and culture of the family, in that she needs to make some decisions about which language is going to be able to be used, and also the fact that the members of the family English is not their first language. Of course, then the next step would be to write these as measurable goals or outcomes on the IFSP. Once you have your goal statements and objectives, remember, in Minnesota, we have to have 2 objectives for every outcome or goal, you would then determine the services and resources the child and family will need to achieve the goals or outcomes that they've identified. Keep in mind that the goal statements should be family-friendly and written in a way that the family can understand them. Now, I can see some of you, if I could see your eyes, I would see you perhaps cringing over the fact that there are no motor goals, such as Paul being able to walk. We don't know if Paul is feeding himself, and the family obviously has not identified this as a priority. There are also not any goals in the area of cognition. But remember, as Dixie said earlier, these are family-driven goals, and these are the things that the family has chosen to work on for right now. Based on the goals and outcomes the family determined, the following team members have been identified as being crucial to completing these goals. First of all, we would have an ECSE teacher. The ECSE teacher is going to demonstrate strategies for the family to use with Paul, perhaps choosing between objects by naming them, placing objects out of reach, and encouraging words to obtain them. She'll also provide starter books of familiar objects. She would give Marisol a reading list from the library of popular English preschool books to read to Paul. She's also going to develop a pictograph or a chart for Marisol so that she can record each new word that Paul has begun to use in both English and Spanish. The service coordinator is going to provide some contact information for an agency that may be able to provide Spanish-English primers for the Spanish-speaking members of the family, Roberto, Anna, and David, and will also help Marisol obtain a library card so that she can go to the library and not have to incur the cost of going out and buying books. And then, of course, the speech therapist is going to do some research and share information with Marisol about the best practices for speech development in bilingual families. It's important to note that the family also has some goals that they're going to take responsibility for. Marisol will update the template that the teacher created for her as Paul learns new words, and will keep it on the wall so that Grandma, Anna, Roberto, and David can learn and help reinforce the new words when they are playing with Paul. Juan, Sophia, and Marisol are going to read simple books to Paul that name objects and help him to say the words in English. The family is also going to spend one evening each week using English to describe objects during their dinner hour together so that all members of the family can help Paul to learn and develop new skills. What's happening here, too, is not only is Paul learning to speak English, but we're also helping Grandma Anna, Roberto, and David to learn English, which could, in fact, benefit the whole family, make it more comfortable for Juan and Sophia to have friends come over as their relatives are learning to speak English, and they may not have to be embarrassed about the fact that the family can't speak English as well. The other concern that you may be thinking to yourself is, what about our 45-day timeline? We've heard from both Dixie and the other advocates that it takes a lot of time to establish a relationship with the family. And as many of you know, we're required to complete that first IFSP within 45 days. Now, what I would say about that is you're not required to complete an IFSP that's written in stone. It may be that initially you've got these outcomes for the family with some goals and objectives, and over time, as you become more familiar with the family and the family becomes more comfortable with you, you may be able to add some goals and outcomes as Marisol maybe sees some new things in the areas of development for Paul once he started to speak some words that she may want to be addressed. So you can get that initial IFSP done and then go back and be adding goals and objectives as time goes on. As we focus on the family outcomes, it's important to remember that if the family achieves the outcomes that they have identified as being priorities, they will be available and engaged in helping their child meet the child's outcomes. As the family is discussing their needs, concerns, and priorities, the team members will also need to make sure that they also address the goals that have been established by the Office of Special Education Programs for families who are receiving early intervention services. For those of you who may not be familiar with them, the goals that OSEP has identified are that families understand their child's strengths, abilities, and special needs, that the family knows their rights and advocate effectively for their children, and that families help their children develop and learn. One outcome that the family may not consider to be as important is that they know how to know their rights and how to advocate for their child. As Dixie mentioned, this may be a difficult concept for families coming from another culture because they're not familiar with this whole notion of challenging authority or questioning something that someone else says to them. The service coordinator, or perhaps the primary service provider, might assume responsibility for helping the family to understand their rights and how to advocate for their child. As Dixie mentioned earlier, this may also involve talking through this information more than once. So you might begin by describing the process at each step along the way and then inviting questions. For example, as the family begins the process, making it clear that nothing can happen without their permission. This will be enforced again when you present the results of the evaluation and ask them to sign that they agree. Again, asking some guiding statements such as, is this how you see your child? Will help the family to be able to express whether or not there are some things that they don't agree with. It will be reinforced once again when you ask them to sign the initial IFSP and then also the subsequent plans. You may have to explain the timelines to the family as well. Again, as for some families, they may not understand the reason why you're trying to hurry some things along or the urgency about getting this plan completed within the 45 days. So explaining that initial timeline might also help them to understand why you're moving at the rate that you're moving. It's important to note that while families have the right to disagree with an evaluation or proposed service, as Dixie mentioned, they may not feel comfortable doing this, and you will need to work to empower the family to question a proposed service if they feel it's not right for their child and family. At this point in time, it might also be appropriate to refer a family to PACER if you feel like they have some questions that would be more helpful to have addressed by one of the multicultural advocates. In talking to one of those advocates, they may help that family explain their rights in a way that would be comfortable for the family and be able to bring them along so that the family is more comfortable exercising their due process rights. The alternative, if you don't do this groundwork with the family, is perhaps the family will consent to everything in writing and agree with you along the way, even though they don't believe that it fits in with their values or beliefs. What's going to happen then is that the family is not going to be working on the goals that you had established. And sometimes I've heard professionals express exasperation about the fact that even though they've got this great plan, the family doesn't seem to be following it or doesn't seem to be going along with what they had talked about. When in fact the reason for this may be that initially the family never really saw the importance or agreed with the goals, and no one took the time to understand and figure out that this was indeed the case. In the case of the Guillermo family, as Marisol and other family members help Paul learn new words, they will be able to report that early intervention services helped them to help Paul develop and learn, and that they were able to provide learning opportunities for Paul. As Barb mentioned, you've got another case study, the Walker family, that you can use to practice this exercise. I would encourage you to look at the Walker family case study, because there's some different things in there that we didn't deal with the Guillermo family. The use of traditional medicine. There's actually an outcome that they established for an older daughter, and the fact that mom will have a job. For many of you, the idea of having to now all of a sudden be responsible for finding a job for mom could be overwhelming. And of course, that's not what they're expecting you to do. Perhaps it's just helping mom get resources or figure out ways to go out and find a job. Through active listening, observation, and support, you will build trust with families as you encourage and support them as they become confident and competent in parenting their child with special needs. Working collaboratively collaboratively with families will then help families to develop an understanding of how to effectively communicate their child's needs, an understanding of their rights and responsibilities in the special education process, and ways to help their child develop and learn. Thanks again for all that you do for kids and families, and if we can be of any help to you in any way, please feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That was really helpful information, I'm sure, to so many. And we are getting ready to end the formal part of today's webinar. We want to, first of all, thank everyone who participated. We have been overwhelmed by the response and hope that this was as beneficial to you as we hoped it would be. I just want to review a couple of things before we go to our optional question and answer session. By the way, we have about 15 great questions that came in, and we're going to take from 10:30 to 11 approximately to have the multicultural advocates and Dixie respond to those. But I want to remind you that the email will come with a link to a web-based evaluation survey that we would need you to complete and return. And as those are received, we'll be sending out the certificates of completion. Beyond the need for the evaluation survey for our project and for you to get the credit, we would really value your response to today's webinar. One of the things that's new to us is we normally can see the people we're presenting to. We can see heads nodding or affirmations. We can kind of judge how the information is being received. And we miss that part of it, and we would really love to hear from you any comments you have about the format for you as well as the content. In addition, remember that questions and answers that aren't dealt with today will be posted to the website, so you may want to revisit that website in the coming days. And if you have any questions, remember you can give me a call at Pacer at either the 952-838-9000 number or our 800 number, or email works great if you email me at bzimke@pacer.org. But before some of you have to go, because I know you have other commitments, some of you may not be able to stay, we really want to just reiterate that we really appreciate all that you do in your work with children, and our hope is that you will find opportunities to use the information and strategies from this training that was shared today in ways that work for you in your work and lead to better outcomes for the families to whom you are providing early intervention and early childhood special ed services and a variety of other ways that you work with families. And we again want to thank you for all you do on behalf of young children and their families. Thank you. For those of you who can stay, we will start the question and answers now. We're going to start with a question to Jesus. And Jesus, the question is, you mentioned that Spanish-speaking families may come from many different countries, but is there a common Spanish language that is the same and understood by all families?
Yes, Barb. There is, and it's the Castilian Spanish, and that's the Spanish that is spoken in all these countries. What has been happening lately is that, and it didn't, I started working at this 12 years ago, and there were very few translations, and they were not very good, by the way, and they were not specialized for our field. Well, nowadays we really have a lot of good material, but it seems that, now the people say, well, that translation maybe for Mexicans, or this translation is more for Puerto Ricans. And it's not really. I mean, I can tell you maybe the difference is between soda and pop, so that there may be colloquialisms that pertain to a certain specific country. But the Castilian Spanish is the one that is commonly understood by everybody.
Thanks, Jesus. Next, we have a question for Dow. Dow, could you please say some more about the idea of using medical services and a healer in your culture? I'm not sure, the questioner says, what is meant by considering other healing practices when writing an IEP or IFSP.
Thank you, Bob. As I said earlier, that when parents see that the child had a delay, they usually go to consult with community healer. what they do is that they will call the healer to come and to have a soon calling or like calling a shaman to come to train to see if the individual family members' spirits are intact with the body. So they will do a whole lot healing from that point. Many families also are familiar with medical services, but they feel that a delay is not like when the child has fever and they had to take to the doctor, So oftentimes they may not bring the delay issue to the medical professional.
Thank you, Dow. Next, we have a question for Hassan. Hassan, the person says, I have worked with 2 Somali families where the main concern, or one of the top concerns, was that the child was not eating. Both little girls needed G-tube feedings. One mother told me that it was very important in Somali culture that the child be plump. I would appreciate anything you could tell me about expectations for eating, self-feeding, weight gain, etc. in young children in the Somali culture.
Thank you, Barb. My mother, that mother is right. Actually, in Somali culture, it's seen a very positive or very encouraged children, especially young children, to be very plump, the border of actually overweight. And I do remember from my personal experience, I do remember when my daughter was 2 years old, and my daughter was an average weight, but every time we visit my mom, who's very traditional, she would just have a fit with me because she wanted my daughter to be really, really overweight. So it's something that in Somali culture, it's very seen kids when they're young to be really plump and almost a borderline. In terms of the expectation of eating, there's no expectation. Kids eat and eat and eat. I mean, they don't have a limit. There's no time frame, and it's good. There's no breakfast and lunch and dinner. Kids are fed any time of the day, all day long, and that sums up.
Thank you, Hassan. That's interesting. We have a question next for Jesus from one of the workers who doesn't work in the homes with children, but rather over by the phone. And this is what they ask. We do not meet families in person, but do child care referrals by telephone. I've been concerned about families understanding, comprehending the information I share, even though they seem to understand. Would you please have any suggestions to help me with this?
I can relate to this question because it is hard to gauge even when you are seeing them in person. So when you're doing it through the phone, it really is more challenging. The only way, and even if you cannot you cannot be sure even if you're using an interpreter, if parents are really understanding, just because of the terminology or because all the new stuff that they are processing. So the best way for me, and the only one, I think that Dixie mentioned that in her presentation, is asking the parents to kind of repeat what they heard, and then that would be a good opportunity to gauge how much they understood, or if they had a misunderstanding. Sometimes even understanding 90% of the whole is kind of dangerous, because in the 10% that is left is where problems may happen. But it is a very interesting question. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesus. Next is a question for Lucy. Lucy, this person is looking for any tips you might have for figuring out what methods of communication are best to use with families, like email versus phone versus in-home meetings. Can you share a bit of your expertise about that?
Sure, Barb. One of the things that I've found useful is that sometimes it may be easier to use mail to reach families. And then also, I've found that many families do not have computers in their home, and also that many families are not even familiar with the Internet. They don't even know what it is. And it may be helpful to have a second number to be able to contact the family to be able to reach them. And if you have any other tips, you can please feel free to contact me, and I'll turn it back to you, Barb.
Thanks, Lucy. Next, I have a question for Bonnie Jean. Bonnie Jean, the person wrote in, could Ms. Smith say more about how to remain transparent when working with families?
And Dixie brought this out in her presentation, that it's important not to assume that parents understand what you're saying, and not to use acronym city, OTPT, and have them sign forms saying this line to them. It's okay, just sign this and we'll put it in. They need to understand that especially initial contact, they need to understand the process that they're doing, so they don't feel as though they're being left out of a piece, or they don't understand, because once that happens, you start building walls.
Thanks, Bonnie Jean. I'm just going to mention, too, at this time that we had a comment come in from one of the participants. They said, thank you for the idea to ask the parent to repeat what they understand. That's very helpful. Next, we're going to go to Hassan with a question. If a Somali family needs to break for prayer while you're in their home, about how long will this take?
It depends, Barb. It depends the size of the family. Sometimes in traditional, families may all pray together, and it depends the size of the family. If 10 people are praying together, it may take up to 20-25 minutes. But normally I would say anywhere between 10 to half an hour. It can be more than half an hour.
Thank you. That'll help people kind of have an idea of what they might expect. And next we have a question for Lucy. Lucy, will you talk a little bit more about the importance of grandparents in the traditional Indian culture?
Sure. I know during Dixie's presentation she talked about the importance of family, and if you look at family the way we define it now in society, we talk about the nuclear family, and that would be mom, dad, and kids. And if you look at our families, our Indian families, we have extended family. And what that means is we have our grandparents, we have our aunties, we have our uncles, and we have family members that are people that may or may not be relatives. And relatives, what I mean by that, could or could not be blood relatives. It may be a neighbor, it may be a best friend. My children have people that they call auntie that are not necessarily, blood relatives to them. And I know that I've gone to meetings with families that they have somebody that will attend. I will be in the meeting, and then they'll have somebody that comes with, and it is somebody that knows the child and is very well familiar with the family, and it's not a relative. And I'll give it back to you, Barb.
Thanks, Lucy. Next, we have a question that came in for Dow, and it relates to something Dixie shared in one of the slides of the presentation about some of the traditional practices that might be encountered in the home. And so the question is, what is cupping?
Okay. Well, cupping is a traditional method of therapy that family use to release the body pressure when, for example, if a child has a fever, family sometimes will do that. It is very difficult to describe how family uses, but sometimes a family will use a calf or a goat's horn to do it. But it is very important that, when using this therapy, it will leave a mark on the body part.
Thanks, Dow. Next, we have a question for Jesus. Jesus, do children whose parents are not legally in this country, do they qualify for medical assistance?
Barb, in the last 2 years, the whole issue of immigration has been so politicized, and it seems that when you just, put the radio or the TV, everybody's an expert on immigration. As far as I know, every child that is born in this country is an American citizen, and they have rights to medical assistance. What is a problem, though, is that many parents that are undocumented, even though they know that their child is eligible, they still they're hesitant to use the services because of the status of undocumented immigrants that they have. They are always afraid of asking for help from the government.
Thank you, Jesus. We have a question for Dixie from the keynote. Dixie, could you please tell us more about the concept of deference and ways we help families understand that we're not just expecting them to agree with us?
Actually, every person in the world shows deference to others. We show it to our grandparents. We show it to our spouses. It's a way of showing respect to people. And for me, showing deference to having a family show deference to us as professionals, which is something we would expect in many minority cultures, is not the same as having them agree with us. So the question relates to how do we help families understand we're not just asking them to agree. It's all about building the relationship. If you have a relationship with a family and you are constantly saying to them, not, this is what I think, what do you think, but tell me how you do this in your home, you're encouraging them to put their information out there first. And this may take some time. If you've built the relationship, the way we show deference to one another is very different when we're comfortable with people than when we're not comfortable with people. When that parent-professional relationship blurs, the problems are much, much less acute. So it's really about how you build the relationship.
Thanks, Dixie. Next, we have a question for Hassan. Hassan, if we have arranged for a home visit and when we arrive no one seems to be there to let us in, how do we handle trying to arrange a second or follow-up visit?
I hope this doesn't happen very often. I would, as a professional, first of all, I would investigate why it happened. It could be a lot of reasons. Punctuality, as Dixie mentioned earlier in her presentation, punctuality and being on time, it means different from different cultures. It could be that appointment was scheduled so far ahead that a lot of Somali families, especially in the greater Minnesota area, tend to work in a late shift. So there's a lot of reasons, but as a professional, I would not be offended. I would not be. I would try to find out exactly what happened and probably work with the interpreter and try to reschedule another appointment. But there could be a lot of reasons. I would not be discouraged as a professional. I would try to reschedule that appointment again and find out.
Thanks, Hassan. Next, we have a question for Jesus. And the person wrote, Jesus, can you talk about developing family plans with families? Is goal setting culturally relevant and appropriate? We have found with some of our Latino families that they find it hard to set regular goals for themselves and their children, and we want to be culturally sensitive in this area.
You know, this is a great question because without generalizing, in our culture, we are not a culture that usually plan for things or are good at budgeting or, looking forward the future. So I can relate to this, but at the same time, while it is our culture, we also understand that now we are in a different country, in a different culture, and I think that it is essential that that we keep that we have goals in IFSPs, not also the law requires it, but what we need to do is to give a lot of information to parents so that they understand what is what we're trying to do in setting these goals. Also, it can be, if not specifically mentioned as goals, you can talk when talking to parents and asking what they hope for their child or how they see the child in the future is what can give us an idea. But I understand that understanding the culture really or being culturally competent is just finding the way in how to outreach and how to convey information. But really understanding that it's a new country, it's a new culture, and we need to get acculturated and just moving forward.
Thank you, Jesus. The next question is going to be directed to Bonnie Jean. The question is, how do you go about building a trustful relationship with a family who has accepted IFSP services, but they don't seem to see the delay in the child and they start asking for less service?
This was an interesting question to me, and I'm going to answer it in two different ways. As a parent that did receive services for one of my children, I remember having the person come in and they would just immediately go to my child and start doing things. There was no relationship. So once I saw the services and what they were working on with my child and she showed me how to do it, I started phasing her out because I didn't feel that I needed her and there was no relationship built. Now, the second part of that I'm going to answer, if it's a first child and they have you come in and then they don't believe, it's really important because most early childhood teachers, educators, professionals have the child development wheel. It's really important to let them know what is really expected at that age level of their child. And then that way they can look at that, ponder it, and decide whether they'd like to keep the services.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie Jean. We have a couple of questions for Dixie that are relative to her presentation. The first one is related to the cultural rules and says, aren't understood rules different for every culture? How do you know all the implicit rules for every culture?
No, it's not true that different rules exist for every culture. They exist for every family and every individual within a family. Each and every person has a unique perspective on the world, and I think that's one of the things I tried to present earlier. You cannot understand the implicit rules of other people's cultures, but you can understand and begin to assess your own implicit rules, what guides you to do as you do, and to begin to understand that those implicit rules that guide your behavior are rules from which you will judge other people and to try to reduce the effect of your judgment on other people. To me, when I meet you on a one-to-one, we have no trouble figuring out how to get along if I trust you and you trust me. Doesn't matter what the rules are because we'll find that common ground. But you first have to understand that if you prefer a firm handshake, then a person who prefers a gentle handshake isn't weak, isn't a weakling, isn't subservient, but a person expressing their own cultural preference. And the trick is for you to not judge other people from your own cultural set of rules. Thank you, Barb.
Thanks, Dixie. Dixie, I'm going to actually follow up with another question to you, if that's okay. Sure. This one, I'm going to read what she said. Sometimes I feel like I am triangulating when I check perceptions with others. I find perception checking to be good, but I also worry that I might be influencing others' perception by expressing mine. How do you regulate this?
You know, that's a really great question because when we meet with parents, and we're a professional, we're already in the driver's seat. We have information and services that those families need. That gives us enormous power in that interaction. To me, if we begin expressing our own perceptions first, we are simply wielding that power in a way that then further dissociates families from their own power and their own knowledge base. So when I check perceptions with other people, it's not, this is what I think, what do you think? It's, how do you feel about this? What would you like to see happen next? And really, you're going to have your perceptions, but it's much more important to gain the perception of the other, in this case the person who comes from a different cultural perspective, than it is to express your own. Because you already have your own. You're going to use your own in developing a plan for that family. So it's how do you check it with other people and put them in the driver's seat by letting them know how important their information is, soliciting that information, but not necessarily at that point in time venturing your own opinion. Thanks.
Thanks, Dixie. We have a kind of a follow-up question to Bonnie related to what she just answered before, but with a little bit different intention, I think. It says, Bonnie, so if I contact a family about receiving services because their child has been screened and qualified and they say, no, thank you, my child is okay, what is my obligation to the service program to serve this family?
And again, I have a two-part answer. The first part is, what is your legal obligation of your organization? You first need to find out what that is. And if it's not something that has to be implemented, it's not driven by the law, then you should always leave the door open, give them service contact information, and always leave the door open in case the family changes their mind.
Thanks, Bonnie Jean. The next question that we have is for Dow. Dow, when considering traditional methods of healing for the ISFP, and you've kind of referred to some of those, what legal issues can emerge, such as proven practice, or does it go against child protection laws?
Thank you, Bob. This is a great question. I would like to say that, many of the new families come to this country don't usually learn about the child protection law, which they are the law to protect children from abuse and neglect. So the home country may not have a similar protection law. So when the family bring some of the traditional method of healing into a discussion, and if you feel that it may resolve as a legal consequence, I would say that, tell the family about the child protection law and to describe in detail about the law so the family know about that.
Thank you. That's really important clarification there. We have another question for Bonnie Jean, and I think this will especially apply to a lot of the professionals who are with us today who are maybe providing other kinds of services besides education. But the question is, how do you include other providers to provide care and education for young children like Head Start, family child care providers, and others?
This one is easy. You invite them if the parents want them included.
That was a short and sweet answer. Thanks, Bonnie Jean. And then we have a couple of questions we're going to direct to Hassan, and these will probably be our final questions during the live portion of the webinar today. But we will, if questions come in that we're not able to answer today, we will post those to our website after the webinar, sometime probably later next week. But Hassan, here are a couple of questions. The first one is, what should a home visitor do when a Muslim family goes to prayer? Will the family go to a different room? Should I go back to my car? Should I leave the home? Will the family tell me what to do?
Most of the families are really good at directing you what you shouldn't be doing any different. Families are really very understandable, and they like to be actually hospitality, and they would offer you maybe something to drink while they're praying, maybe something to do while they're praying. Do you want to relax and go to the living room, let's say? So most of the families are very good at that. They do recognize that you are there, and they want you to feel comfortable while you are at their home. So don't feel uncomfortable. Just just sit where you were sitting, and if there's a member of the parent who is a member of the family who is not praying, you can just conversate with them.
And is this the kind of thing where if they don't give you direction, it would be fine to say, what would you like me to do during this time? Or
no, I actually wouldn't ask.
Okay.
Yeah, I just would not put them in that position. I would just, I know they're going to pray, so I would just either do my work, just to be where I'm at, or most likely, most of the time, I'm pretty much sure family will offer you something to do.
Okay.
And you can just say, no, I'm fine. I just going to read my papers or anything of that nature.
Okay, thank you, Hassan. And then, Hassan, I have another question for you. And this will be our last question for the day. It's a great question. What would be different words to use for different cultures instead of the word disability to avoid the stigma or misunderstanding, whatever, around the child's condition?
Barb, as I mentioned earlier, families eventually, once they warm up to you and you get to know each other, they'll be very open-minded to listen to you and to listen to your input. But as I work with professionals, sometimes I suggest to find another way to rephrase it. Instead of saying your child has a disability, I would, recommend them to say something like, research indicates that children 2 years old, they should be saying at least a 1 or 2 sentences, and use it that way instead of being blunt about it and just say, your child has a disability and a 2 years old child should be speaking or should be saying a sentence by now. A different way of that. And eventually, you will find that comfort level where you can communicate with the parent and say, it's a great concern to me that your child is not doing this at this age and so forth.
Right. And I think it reminds me, too, of something Dixie referred to in her presentation, where she mentioned that we should really take the lead from the family, initially reflect the language that they use around their child's development until a time later in the relationship when perhaps we can begin to explain how the language to get services relates to the child's developmental ability.
That's right, and exactly as I said earlier also, this is where your interpreter comes handy. Right. They do know a tender way to put it together that word, and very receptive for the family to explain to them that disability to the family, and say things like, in this country, kids are expected to progress at this age. So that's when your interpreter can be a tool to use.
Great. Thank you so much, Hassan. And once again, we want to thank everyone for participating today. We look forward to reading your comments and reading your feedback. And if you have any other questions, be sure to contact us. And if there's any way we at PACER can help you in your work with working with families, and again, you can refer families to us, we would really welcome the opportunity to be involved. Hope everyone has a great day. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.